Next, from Springfield,
AFSCME Council 31 holds a press conference along with fellow AFSCME members from around the state who work in the Department of Corrections. These correctional officers explain how dangerous inmates are being moved from maximum security to medium security prisons in order to save money, and how this has led to a 51% increase in attacks by inmates toward correctional officers.
This runs about 40 minutes.
Defending. Unfortunately, in recent years, education and treatment programs in Illinois adult and juvenile correctional facilities have been significantly cut back, especially in the adult prisons. At the same time, both cost-driven operational changes and legally imposed policy changes have combined to significantly increase outbreaks of violence, resulting in a growing number of assaults on correctional employees. Our union looked at the annual assaults on staff in calendar year 2015 and 2016 and compared them with projected annual assaults in 2017 based on the data available thus far this year. And what we found is that since 2015, there has been a 49% increase in assaults on employees in the Department of Juvenile Justice and a 51% increase, in 2 years in assaults on correctional employees in the Department of Corrections. In both cases, those assaults increased even though the youth and inmate population is actually declining. In a correctional facility, in a correctional system, just as in our society, there have to be consequences for breaking the rules. Those consequences have to be proportionate to the infraction, and they have to be applied fairly and consistently. That is not happening in either the Department of Corrections or the Department of Juvenile Justice today. Instead, there is a growing unwillingness on the part of DOC and DJJ to issue and implement clear penalties for rule violations, even for violent assaults. Whatever the reason for these changes in policy, inarguably, they have reduced the tools corrections staff can use to maintain order. And it's very important to stress that DOC staffing patterns are based on the assumption of order. For example, there are often only 1 or 2 staff present when lines of inmates are moving. The Department of Juvenile Justice has undergone a similar laxity and consistent enforcement of its own rules. The Governor's Corrections Reform Committee urged DOC to classify inmates' security levels based on what they termed the offender's real threat and not just on the type of crime originally committed. But we've heard from counseling staff, who are the ones supposedly making those determinations, that they are under pressure to have an ever greater number of inmates reclassified to an effectively lower level. And rather than a process which includes input from the frontline staff who are most familiar with the behavior of the inmates in question, those decisions are being made at a high managerial level. And the numbers of assaults, we believe, bears witness to the flaws in that process. Since new good time and sentencing policies were implemented in 2016, there has actually been a 5% reduction in the prison population. Since the changes having the biggest impact on inmates who were sentenced for class 1 to 4 crimes, we would expect to see the most significant reduction occurring in minimum security facilities. In fact, population in minimum facilities decreased only at about the same rate as the system as a whole. And in medium facilities, in fact, there was no reduction in population at all. But the population at maximum security facilities actually fell by 18% as murder and Class X offenders have been moved to medium and even minimum security prisons. Why, with all the changes going on now and in policies and procedures, would departmental management increase the risk to staff by increasing the population of inmates with more violent past in lower level facilities? Is it because, and we don't know the answer, but we're trying to imagine what it could be, is it because prisons with lower security classifications have lower staffing levels and cost less to operate, and that far too little attention is paid to the human cost of increasing violence against staff? The recurring pain, the family turmoil, the psychological trauma, and even the permanent disability that can occur when staff are subject to violent assaults. Underlying the changes in policy and procedures is the operational assumption that we believe is completely unacceptable, that staff should expect to be assaulted, and that is part of the job, and that DOC does not feel an active obligation to contain those assaults. What I'd like to do now is call up 4 employees who have been either directly involved or directly witnessed assaults to describe them to you, and then after they speak, I'll outline some of the steps we believe could help to address this situation. And first I would like to call up Elena Lewis, who is a correctional officer at Pontiac Correctional Center, a maximum security facility. I'm sure most of you know where Pontiac is, and she's the recording secretary of our local union there, AFSCME Local 494. I'll clear away all my notes so she can have the podium.
Hi, my name is Elena Lewis. I'm a correctional officer at Pontiac Correctional Center, and I'm the recording secretary for the AFSCME Local 494. Pontiac is a maximum security prison that houses the state's most dangerous offenders. Last year, I was one of several officers injured in an attack by at least 5 inmates. That afternoon, we were moving inmates from the yard to the cell house when I saw an inmate begin repeatedly punching a lieutenant in the face. Other inmates joined in. I tried to restrain an inmate, telling him to stop hitting another officer attempting to help in the back of the head. I was able to pull the offender off, but in the struggle hit my own head, and later in the struggle, my shoulder into the staircase. All this time I couldn't see because the lieutenant had been forced to use chemical spray to regain control. Finally, staff flooded the cell house to help us. It felt like forever. When you're in that situation, even a few minutes is a long time. 6 of us staff went to the hospital that day. I had a possible concussion and a shoulder injury that needed physical therapy and left my arm in a sling for weeks. Others involved had concussions, lacerations, and torn muscles. At least 5 inmates were involved in the assault. They were transferred out from Pontiac to other facilities, but the disciplinary tickets that they received for the assaults were dropped. That means they received no consequences from the Department of Corrections for their actions in assaulting us that day. Talking to reporters, DOC spokesmen blamed us, the staff, not the inmates who attacked us. But our union didn't let it rest. After we met with the Livingston County State's Attorney, 4 of the inmates were indicted for charges ranging from resisting a peace officer or correctional employee to aggravated battery of a peace officer. The outcome of those charges is still pending. It was one of the biggest assaults we had at Pontiac in a while, but I'm sorry to say it wasn't the last. Since then, an officer was stabbed in the head, and just prior to our incident, another was assaulted, suffering a concussion, as has had to be off work for several months. As a union, we're sticking together and speaking out to make our jobs and facilities safer. But DOC has to have consequences for inmates who break the rules, especially when they assault staff.
Thank you, Elena. Next, I'd like to call up Cody Dorns. Cody is a correctional officer at East Moline Correctional Center. He's the president of AFSCME Local 46 there.
My name is Cody Dornis. I'm a correctional officer at East Moline Correctional Center and a president of AFSCME Local 46. East Moline is a minimum security facility with a single fence in the middle of a neighborhood. We have dorms made up of rooms which house up to 8 men, and those doors don't lock. 2 dorms are connected by a hallway to form what we call double dorms with well over 100 inmates. We're not equipped to handle more violent and dangerous inmates, but we're getting them reclassified from medium security facilities. In July, DOC changed their guidelines, so we started to receive murderers, sex offenders, and other Class X offenders. We also don't have enough staff. We've raised the need for more staff on all shifts many times. And DOC needs to deal with the influx of mentally ill inmates. I've worked at East Moline for 7 years, and I've seen the number of mentally ill inmates increase steadily every year. And we have no official mental health unit. Before, when you identified an offender with a severe mental illness, you could ship him off to Dixon's treatment unit. But now, more often than not, he stays. Excuse me. We have so many that an entire unit now houses just mentally ill inmates. Last month, the officer working a double dorm overnight alone with more than 100 inmates was attacked from behind. She was struck in the head repeatedly with a rock. He was a Class X offender sentenced to 20 years for aggravated vehicular hijacking with a weapon. The officer pushed the man down button, but the call wasn't exactly heard. The only lieutenant on shift that night heard unusual radio traffic and took off to check it out. Luckily, he was in the same building. He found her bleeding out on the floor. She needed 6 staples in her head, and she's still off work recovering from her injuries. To make our facility safer, we need more staff. This officer shouldn't have been alone. We need radios that work, a problem that we raised to management the months leading up to the assault. We need DOC to stop classifying dangerous inmates and assign them to less secure facilities. And we need the appropriate treatment and placement of mentally ill inmates, including holding them accountable for their actions. We cannot say that just because an inmate has some form of mental illness, that there will be no consequences for his violent behavior.
Pronounce your last name for me.
Dornis. Dornis.
Dornes.
And when the time is right, I'd like to have him address the radio issue.
Yeah, we're going to have ample time for questions for everyone. Next, I'd like to call up Linda Magrum. Linda is a juvenile justice specialist at the Illinois Youth Center, Harrisburg, and a trustee of AFSCME Local 779.
Hello. I'm Linda Mangrum, a juvenile justice specialist at IYC Harrisburg. I was assaulted in March and was off work for 4 months, and I'm still seeing doctors. But I think it's more important to talk about a sexual assault that happened on an AFSCME member not even a month ago. It demonstrates one of the biggest problems we face in trying to do our jobs safely. A small percentage of youth cause trouble and are not being held accountable for their actions. A 19-year-old with a history of sexual misconduct was supposed to be on my unit, but he was in A building because he was acting up. On A building, he and another youth were allowed to sleep in a recreational room. They had urinated all over the room, rubbed feces everywhere. The next morning, an officer tried to get them to clean up the mess. When a female supervisor came in, the 19-year-old pulled out his penis and began to masturbate and said, "I bet you want this." A manager got involved. Instead of holding the youth accountable, he made him a deal. The manager said if the youth came back to the unit, he didn't have to go to school and he could use the rec room all day. The manager and female supervisor walked the youth down to the unit. On our unit, he kept acting out and refusing to go to his room. The manager let this youth walk around the unit, complaining about the rules, stirring up my unit. The supervisor told the manager that the youth is too agitated, he needs to go back to A building. The manager leaves the female supervisor, who the youth has already sexually harassed, to take the youth back to A building. The manager stays on my unit. A few minutes after she leaves, she makes a distress call over the radio, and you could hear in her voice that it was bad. When they were alone, the youth grabbed the female supervisor with his erect penis out of his pants and began dragging her into A building rec room. She finally got to disperse chemical spray and was able to call on the radio. An officer responded quickly and removed the youth off of the supervisor, but she was very distressed. And very distressed from this incident and is still off work. We should have structured programs for these youth with consequences. Instead of administration makes deals with 10% of the youth that start trouble in our facility. That undermines the entire program and encourages the youth to act out. This really needs to stop.
Thank you, Linda. And then our final speaker is going to be Corey Knope, Correctional Officer from Lawrence Correctional Center and President of AFSCME Local 3600.
Hello, I am Corey Knope. I'm a correctional officer at Lawrence Correctional Center and president of AFSCME Local 3600. We've had some very serious staff assaults in the last 18 months. In some cases, officers were hurt so badly they're still off work recovering. Most recently, an officer suffered whiplash and lacerations that required stitches in his head from an inmate assault. Another serious recent assault shows two problems that IDOC needs to address: classifying inmate security levels honestly and listening to frontline employees about staffing needs. Under its new sentencing structure, IDOC isn't locking people up for petty crimes, and they're giving out more good time. That frees up beds in minimum security facilities, and now, because lower security facilities are cheaper to run, they're filling these open minimum security beds by reclassifying medium security inmates. And they're reclassifying maximum security inmates and sending them to medium security prisons like Lawrence. This is very dangerous. We ended up with an offender who was a 4-time staff assaulter. He was reclassified from max to medium, and 3 weeks later, he was at Lawrence where he assaulted an officer. He struck the CO in the face with his closed fist, punching him several times. They shipped the inmate back to the maximum security facility, but obviously they never should have reclassified this known staff assaulter. Our union has a security review team that visits facilities across the state and makes recommendations. 2 months ago, they came to Lawrence. One issue we raised was that we only had one security officer in the healthcare unit with up to 30 inmates. To prevent a scenario where a lone officer was assaulted and couldn't open the electric door for backup, we asked for a second healthcare officer. Management told us no. That scenario is exactly what happened. The officer who was punched in the face was struggling with the inmate. He couldn't call for help. A nurse had to. When help responded, he couldn't open the door. The nurse had to fight her way around the altercation to get to the door, then wasn't familiar with how to open the door. Those delays meant minutes went by before other staff got in to help the officer. Literally the next day, we got what we asked for 2 months earlier: a second officer on the healthcare unit. I just wish an officer didn't have to be injured to make that happen. Both instances show IDOC being reactive instead of proactive. We're tired of waiting for our members to be hurt before they do something about it. Thank you.
So we're here today because we want to say that these kind of assaults are preventable. They can be prevented. Obviously, working in a correctional facility entails a certain amount of risk, and every one of the individuals here is keenly aware of that. But they should not be placed at unnecessary risk. And that, as you can see, I think in several of these situations, is exactly what's happening. So we'd like to talk about some things that we think are possible solutions. As you heard, virtually all of these are things that have been raised both at the facility level and at the statewide level, and we don't feel that the response has been appropriate to the scale of the problem. So first, increase staffing levels. Now, that may not be true every single place, every single time, but there's no doubt that there are pressure points in this system where staffing is completely inadequate. You heard about the situation at East Moline Correctional Center, where one officer was effectively alone with over 100, am I remembering correctly, over 100 inmates. The circumstances of those that attack at East Moline and at Lawrence highlight how inadequate staffing in particular post puts employees at risk. At Lawrence, management saw the wisdom of what the union had been requesting to staff on duty only after the assault occurred. We don't want people to have to be injured in order for change to come about. And even after the brutal attack, East Moline management continues to refuse the union's long-stated demand that the 2 dorms housing 110 men with mental health issues should be covered by more than 1 officer on the shift. Having enough staff on a shift available to respond to emergencies is directly related to safety. Second, we talked today about the reclassification process. It's a very subterranean, I'll say almost mysterious process. Even people who work in the facilities often have no idea how these determinations are being made. Cody can tell you, people just show up, right? Just all of a sudden, someone who is with a very, very serious criminal record is showing up in a minimum security facility. So we want a halt to what we believe are budget-driven reclassifications. With all the changes going on in DOC, and there's some of them, as we indicated, we know are court-driven, legally driven, but with all of that, now is not the time for the kind of wholesale reclassification of inmates, sending them to lower security facilities that are not equipped to handle them. Why was Lawrence, a medium security facility, asked to house a maximum security offender with a history of staff assault? And any reclassification that does occur should be based on consultation with the staff on the front lines who work most closely with the inmates. Right now, staff have absolutely no input into the decisions with regard to reclassification. Those are being made by people at the top who don't observe the inmates' behavior day in and day out. And there should not be a quota on reclassifications. Counselors are being told you must reclassify X number of people. We don't think that's an appropriate way to operate. Third, there have to be consequences for breaking rules. You heard what Elena described about the situation at Pontiac, where you had 5 inmates whom a state's attorney has now deemed merit some form of criminal charges, and the department would not impose any form of sanction on them. And we are seeing this increasingly throughout the department. Certainly, there are a lot of rules that are being broken that we don't think should be broken, that we think inmates should be held accountable for. But, Linda talked about just feces, urine, those kind of things that we think should be considered rule breaking and people should be held accountable for. But when it comes to assaults on staff, it is outrageous that there is no accountability when inmates are involved in violent attacks on staff. What is the message that is being sent in those circumstances? Even if an inmate is moved to another facility, and that frequently does happen after an assault, they'll be moved to another facility. But of course, in our view, that is just transferring the problem. And in many cases, the inmate doesn't find that a particularly burdensome consequence of their actions. So we think it is extremely important that there be consequences when there are assaults on staff, and that is not happening now. Fourth, and John alluded to this earlier, provide working equipment. At a minimum, management should ensure that basic equipment like man-down buttons and radios work consistently. When problems are identified with equipment, management must devise an immediate solution. But for the actions of a diligent lieutenant at East Moline, faulty equipment could have made a vicious assault a much greater tragedy. And finally, and this may seem broad or amorphous, but we have to say it, management has got to care. They have to care about employee safety. We cannot be in a situation where we're being told, well, the courts are putting pressure on us, the legislature's putting pressure on us, we have to do these things. You don't have to do things that put people's lives in unnecessary jeopardy. And that is what's happening today. And the message being sent is that the concern is saving dollars, the concern is a consistency with consent decrees, the concern is a good public relations position, and I'm sure you're going to hear more about that today. But there's no concern being expressed for the officers who are hurt. And as Elena told you, and I know how distressed, I know Will Lee is here, the president at Pontiac Correctional Center, to have, after these officers are in the hospital, after they're being treated, after they've been traumatized, to then have management turn around and say, well, it was their fault because there's some rule that the warden didn't even know existed, that they supposedly weren't following, and so it's their own fault that they were assaulted. That's the kind of attitude that is damaging employee morale in this department and in the Department of Juvenile Justice to a very serious degree. So you have to have a foundation of leadership at the top that wants to address the problem, that is concerned about employee safety on the job, that recognizes, yes, this is a dangerous job and we're asking people to take it on. And if we ask them to take it on, we as a society, then we should do everything possible to protect their health and safety. And that's the number one thing that we're calling for today. So I'm going to open it now to questions. I promised John. Yeah.
Well, I had a question before that about the radio would be, how do you define assault? What is the universe of assault?
Well, that's it. Generally, the department does the definitions. We're taking their data, and it could be anything. I mean, any.
Verbal assault? Or is
No, it's not verbal assault. No, it has to. No, it's not. It doesn't include like I say you're. Well, I won't swear, but if I say.
some physical contact?
Yes, some form of physical assault. Thank you. That'd be a good description. Yeah.
These numbers are from DOC, it's not an internal AFSCME thing.
Yes, we did the calculations.
So what is that?
I'm sorry.
What are those numbers?
Oh, these numbers. Okay, so these are the numbers of assaults on staff. And this is, I'm sorry, this is the Department of Corrections. I couldn't see where you were pointing to, right? And this is the Department of Juvenile Justice. And this is showing you from 2015, 2016, and 2017. There's an asterisk here. What that asterisk means is that we've projected based on 7 months of data, I think in DOC, and 8 months of data in DJJ, what the number would be out for the year.
Their numbers.
Yeah.
Because in the past, I know that the AFSCME and DOC, under past administrations, DOC has called, redefined assault, and AFSCME is objecting to that. These are their numbers, what they're calling assault.
Yes.
You know, if we were to hear from inmates, the stereotype might be, the air conditioning doesn't work in the prison, or our cable TV doesn't get enough channels, and I think as a society we say, I don't want to hear that. They're prisoners. We don't care about them. It's prison. And your remarks wrapping it all up make it sound like your complaints are gaining about the same amount of currency where people don't want to hear them. Is that how you feel?
Well, I don't feel that way. I really don't. I think that we've had tremendous concern in the community. We had a picket at Pontiac after the assaults there, and in the East Moline area. I think there's a lot of public concern. That's why we're here today. What is concerning to us is that there's not concern at the top, from top management, from the governor's office. I mean, I think that the public, if they knew, and that's why we're trying to get the word out, what people endure, they would be very concerned. I mean, everyone recognizes that this is a very important job. We as a society have decided that we will have correctional facilities, that when crimes are committed, whether for purposes of, as I said, paying a debt to society or for purposes of getting someone who is very dangerous off the streets, we have prisons and we ask people to work in them to keep them secure. And they're responsible both for the security and order in the prisons and for the safety of the inmates. We don't think their own safety should needlessly be put at risk. And I think the public, most people, very much agree with that.
Well, because you did something else, and you're saying that the public cares, but the people who are in charge don't care.
I'm saying, right.
Act like them.
The people at the top don't care. I think the public does care, but the public's not aware.
Roberta, do you have you run the numbers on what kind of additional staff you would need across the board?
No, we have not. That's a very good question. You know, we've cited specific circumstances, and so as a starting point, what we're saying is at the facility level, where the local union, believe me, they don't just come in and say, good morning, we need 100 staff today. You know, they identify specific problem points. And so our first concern is at the facility level where the local union has said, this is a problem point. We know. We've seen problems arising. We need more staff here. That's number one. Number two, we are prepared to, willing to, I'll say eager to sit down with management and do a review of overall staffing at each facility and what changes might or might not be needed at each facility. But that we don't have a number today, like a magic big number to pull out of a hat. Yeah.
And the places where they're short-staffed, are they working unreasonable amounts of overtime to cover?
Well, there is, as you know, there is an ongoing problem with overtime in the Department of Corrections. And there is still, I actually don't know today if overtime is up or down. I can't tell you that right now. There is always a problem with overtime, and oftentimes people working to the point of exhaustion. I mean, what's unreasonable is, of course, if somebody is too exhausted to do their job properly. And we still do have problems with a lot of overtime. Over the past 5-6 years, overtime has actually gone down, but I can't tell you the data today. I wouldn't want to answer that without knowing it precisely.
Yeah.
I'm seeing the increase from 2013 to 2016. I don't know the 2014 numbers, but if the trend is similar, you're seeing an increase. Where has it actually been in those years, and is it spread too thin, taking care of receptionists in one department, but then also being responsible for ensuring the safety and security of prison guards?
AFSCME? You know what? The Department of Corrections is responsible for ensuring the safety and security of its own employees. And they're the only ones who can do it, and they're failing at the job. So no, the union isn't spread too thin. These guys, they work every day in a prison. And on top of that, they are working every day for the security and safety of their members. No, they're not. Yeah, they may be spread thin, but if they're spread thin, it's because management is not doing its job. They're doing their job, I guarantee you. They're doing their job in the prison, and they're doing their job, doing everything they can to protect their members.
Well, I'm not talking about the members, I'm talking about the union.
This is the union. This is the union right here behind me. Raise your hands. Stand up. This is the union, okay? I am not the union. I'm one person. This is the union, and they are on the job every single day. Yeah. Anders?
One more question. I wanted to ask, Cody Dornis mentioned that there were some guidelines changed in July. Is there a document that he was referring to? Can I point to something? Is this like, you're saying that the guidelines are mysterious, but you mentioned it.
I'm sorry, can you say the document again that you wanted?
I think Cody Dornis, if I'm saying that right, mentioned that there was a DOC change guidelines in July. So this was about the reclassification.
Yeah, we could
Can you speak to that as far as what documents that were allowed to be transferred?
It kind of goes back to the TCO, the transfer coordinator's office, and they are pretty much picks and choose what inmates go where across the state. And during July, they had redefined their requirements for each individual prison. We had started out at 5 years when I got there. We had jumped to 6. We jumped to 8. And this past July, it's anybody who has less than 10 years to do. It's also added in moderate escape risk, regardless of the crime. We have murderers, sex offenders, rapists.
And that's also new.
Yes.
Is this
But-
just on,
Do you have a written copy of that? He's asking if there's anything.
I have
in
the-
writing.
Something like a FOIA, like what would it?
I mean, the TCO manual would be one of them. The clinical TCO manual would state one of those things, and I imagine they sent out something to,
Just so just to be clear, so I'm not familiar with these policies. So at one point, your facility said only people who are fewer than 5 years to zero.
yes.
Now it's 10
And
years.
if you work your way down to 10. So if you had 20 years, as soon as you hit that 10-year mark, you come into East Moline, no matter what the crime. Yes.
are these issues just juvenile or?
No. This is primarily adult facilities where this is occurring. And this is an adult facility that Cody's talking about.
And so also at East Moline, there used to be, if you had
Andrew,
committed
if you're gonna
murder
speak,
or
would you
sex
speak up?
offense, you couldn't be at East Moline. That's changed. If you were deemed to be an escape risk, you couldn't be at East Moline. That has changed. They'll now permit inmates who are deemed to be an escape risk to be transferred to East Moline. That's all changed.
Tony,
But
also,
we-
the radio, have you, or any of you run equipment that isn't working that management didn't fix in a timely manner?
I mean, the radio system we have now isn't working, and it's not being fixed in a timely manner. We've brought this up for countless months.
Not working, what do you mean?
You can't hear clear reception across the hill. You can be in one area, not hear something going on somewhere else. You can be standing next to somebody, that radio goes off and yours doesn't. Very similar to our man down button. That night, our radios are designed to go on 20-second intervals, 20-second on, 20-second off. At that night, most of the officers reported they heard maybe a half second. Some didn't hear any. The Armory heard the call, but nobody else did. And on top of it, there was no responding staff there either.
Is it outdated?
It's actually a newer handheld, a newer base radio. It's just not designed for the setup of East Moline. We're a facility full of hills, valleys, old concrete walls.
20 seconds on, so you hit the button, the mic stays open.
It'll stay open for 20 seconds. Yeah, so you can scream out for help, say where you're at and whatnot.
Do you know if that policy change is legislatively dictated, or is that something that the city doesn't?
I think kind of like what we said, it's kind of a budgetary issue. I mean, minimums are cheaper to run.
Is this, have all of this issues arisen as a result of the budget standoff, or were they pre-existing to Governor Brown?
Well, obviously, as we're showing here, I don't know the extent to which it's connected to the budget. That's why we're trying to point to the various factors that are coming together. But certainly, the reclassifications and the driving down of inmates into the minimum and medium security facilities appears, we don't know this for a fact, it appears to be budget driven, but we don't know that for a fact. We're just showing that certainly there's been a dramatic shift in this reclassification policy in the last 2 years, has intensified greatly. It coincides with court orders, and so there's a number of different factors. I don't think you could put it all on the budget standoff per se. I think there's different factors coming together.
One other thing is, one of the major initiatives of Governor Browner, working with Democrats, like Kwame Raoul and others, is to reduce the prison population by 25% over 10 years. Knowing what you all know, is that a problem? Is that the root of the problem, that they're trying to force a non-workable solution on the system? Or can that be accommodated in a manner that doesn't put either the staff or communities at risk?
You know, I don't know that we're the body. You know, there's other people that make judgments about those issues. And let me just, no, but from our perspective is that we want employees to be safe, whatever policy legislators and policymakers decide to pursue. And could you release inmates without putting employees at harm? You could, but that's why we're pointing out why, yes, we're communities. Why is the big decline, an 18% decline, in the maximum security facilities which house the murderers, which house the most serious offenders? That's where there's an 8% decline in population. So if you were pursuing this in a responsible way, the release of people, then you would expect that the decline in population would be in the minimum security facilities. Those would be the people most likely to be able to safely be released onto our streets. Can we safely release maximum security inmates onto the streets? No, we can't, and I'm not saying that's what's happening, but we're unsafely releasing those inmates into medium and minimum security facilities, which are not equipped to handle them.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, guys.